Chapter 1. Introduction. The Legacy of Rome in the East. When we speak of the Byzantine Empire today, we think of magnificent churches, golden mosaics, emperors with purple robes, and the last bastion of ancient Rome, which continued to exist almost 1,000 years after its fall. But the people who lived in this empire never called themselves Byzantines. For them, they were simply Romans, heirs and continuators of the Roman Empire, only with a new capital in the east and a culture that emphasized the Greek heritage more strongly. The Byzantine Empire did not emerge as a sudden refoundation, but as a continuation and transformation. When the Western Roman Empire fell in the 5th century, the eastern part, with its capital Constantinople, survived. This is where the gold was located. This is where the big cities were located. This is where trade pulsated. While Rome was being sacked by Germanic tribes, Constantinople remained a beacon of power, protected by massive walls and supported by a prosperous economy. But Byzantium was more than just a remnant of Rome. It developed its own identity, Christian, with the emperor as God's representative on earth, Greek in language and culture, and politically shaped by a fine balance between tradition and adaptability. This empire saw itself as the center of the world, a mediator between East and West, between Christianity and Islam, between antiquity and the Middle Ages. The history of the Byzantine Empire is a story of ups and downs, of breathtaking splendor and bitter decline. It ranges from the founding of Constantinople in the 4th century to the fall of the city in 1453, almost 11 centuries in which Byzantium repeatedly reinvented what it meant to be Rome. During this long time, the empire encountered countless enemies: Persians, Arabs, Bulgarians, Crusaders, Ottomans. It waged wars, formed alliances, and conducted diplomacy at the highest level. At the same time, it produced a culture that decisively shaped the world of the Middle Ages, from icon painting to theology to the preservation of ancient writings that later fueled the Renaissance in Europe. Rome's legacy lived on in the East, but it was not unchanged. The history of Byzantium is the history of an empire that constantly fluctuated between tradition and renewal, that asserted itself through its adaptability and became a symbol of permanence despite all the crises. When we tell this story now, we follow an empire that saw itself as the center of the world, and yet, in the end, perished when the walls of Constantinople could no longer withstand the cannons of the Ottomans in 1453. In between, however, lies a fascinating world that shows us how history never stands still, but changes, reinvents itself, and yet always leaves traces. Chapter 2. Constantine the Great and the Founding of Constantinople. At the beginning of Byzantine history stands a man who is one of the most influential figures of antiquity, Constantine the Great. His name is inextricably linked with two developments that were to determine the course of world history for thousands of years: the recognition of Christianity and the founding of a new capital, Constantinople. The Emperor and Christianity. Constantine rose to prominence at a time when the Roman Empire was shaken. Civil wars, rivalries, and economic problems had made the imperial thrones unsafe. When Constantine was proclaimed Augustus by his troops in 306 AD, he was only one of several rulers vying for power, but he was to outlast them all. The turning point came in 312, at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. According to legend, before the battle, Constantine saw a cross in the sky with the words, "In this sign you will conquer." He had the sign of Christ painted on the shields of his soldiers and won. A year later, he issued the Milan Edict, which granted Christians freedom of religion for the first time. In doing so, he laid the foundation for the Christianization of the empire, even though he himself was only baptized on his deathbed. The choice of a new capital. But Constantine's second great deed was to change the face of history even more. Rome, the old capital, was no longer suitable for him. Too far west, too burdened by traditions, too susceptible to attacks. He needed a new center, strategically favorable, rich in possibilities, a symbol of a new era. He chose Byzantium, a small Greek city on the Bosporus. Its location was unique, at the interface between Europe and Asia, between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Whoever controlled this city controlled trade, the routes of the armies, and the connection between East and West. In 330, Constantine solemnly inaugurated the city as Constantinople, the city of Constantine. It was not only to be a new capital, but also a new Rome, equipped with a senate, palaces, forums, and triumphal arches. But it was at the same time different, more modern, more Greek. The foundation for Byzantium. With Constantinople, the emperor laid the foundation for an empire that was to last for over 1,000 years. The city was given massive walls that made it almost impregnable, magnificent churches that embodied faith, and a location that guaranteed trade and wealth. For the people of that time, it was clear Constantine had ushered in a new era. The center of the empire finally shifted eastwards. The old Rome remained venerable, but the new Rome on the Bosporus was the future. In Constantinople, Roman law, Greek culture, and Christian faith were combined. This mixture was to become the basis of the Byzantine Empire, an empire that was both continuation and transformation, a legacy and a reinvention. Constantine himself died in 337, but his work outlasted him by far. He had not only founded a new capital, but also created a new vision. Rome was no longer just the heart of the world. Now, it was beating on the Bosporus.
Chapter 3. The Empire under the First Emperors, Christianity and Continuity. After Constantine's death in 337, the empire entered a period of transition marked by uncertainty, but also by continuity. The successors of the great emperor not only had to cope with the daunting task of keeping the empire together, but also decide which path it should take religiously and politically. Constantine had set the course, but the question remained as to how his legacy would be continued. The division and internal struggles. As so often in Roman history, power was divided after the death of an emperor. Constantine's three sons, Constantine II, Constans, and Constantius II, divided the empire among themselves. But unity did not last long. Battles between the brothers meant that soon only Constantius II remained, who ruled as sole ruler until 361. During this time, it was already clear how difficult it was to hold the huge empire together. Again and again, battles broke out on the borders, against Persia in the east, against Germanic tribes in the west. Constantinople remained the center, but the empire was riddled with tensions. Christianity and its opponents. The biggest change, however, concerned religion. Constantine's decision to promote Christianity had set in motion a development that could no longer be stopped. Under Constantius II, Christianity was increasingly favored, while pagan cults lost importance. But Christianization was not without conflict. Internally, the church was divided on doctrinal issues, such as the dispute over the nature of Christ. Was he divine, human, or both at the same time? These disputes, which became known as the Arian strife, shook the empire and showed that Christianity was on the rise, but by no means united. A brief counter-movement came under Julian the Apostate, 361 to 363. He was a nephew of Constantine and tried to revive the old pagan gods. With great zeal, he promoted temples, sacrifices, and ancient cults. But his reign was short-lived, and after his early death, the empire finally returned to Christianity. From tolerance to state religion. The decisive turning point came with Emperor Theodosius I, who ruled from 379 to 395. Under him, Christianity was not only preferred, but elevated to the sole state religion. Pagan cults were banned, temples were closed or destroyed, and the church was given a central role in the empire. This was the final break. The kingdom that had once been the home of Jupiter, Mars, and Venus now became the kingdom of Christ. The bishops gained enormous influence. Councils such as that of Constantinople in 381 shaped doctrine, and the cross became a symbol of power. Continuity and change. At the same time, much remained Roman: the administration, the legal system, the army. The Byzantine Empire was not an entirely new entity, but a continuity of the Roman Empire, only with a new center and a new religious foundation. The combination of Roman tradition and Christian vision was unique, and it made the empire strong enough to last for centuries. But it also brought tensions between the emperor and the church, between tradition and faith, between East and West. When Theodosius died in 395, he finally divided the empire under his sons into a western and an eastern part. While the West was soon to be overrun by Germanic tribes, the East survived. And it was this East, with Constantinople as its heart, that we call Byzantium today.
Chapter 4. Justinian I and Theodora. Splendor and greatness of early Byzantium. When you think of early Byzantium, the name Justinian I almost always comes up first. He ruled from 527 to 565 and is considered one of the most important emperors in the entire Byzantine history. Under him, the empire achieved a splendor that was reminiscent of ancient Rome, but at the same time received a new Christian character. His reign was a mixture of breathtaking successes and enormous burdens, a reflection of the Byzantine fate. Justinian and Theodora, an unusual ruling couple. Justinian did not come from the old aristocracy of Rome, but from humble circumstances. His origins in the Balkan region show how much the empire was now influenced by the East. But he brought extraordinary energy and ambition with him. At his side was his wife Theodora, a woman who came from a modest and even scandalous background. She had been an actress, an activity that had little prestige at the time. But Theodora possessed intelligence, political shrewdness, and remarkable strength. Together with Justinian, she formed a ruling couple that embodied a new image of imperial power: Christian, determined, almost superhuman in her claim. The dream of the restoration of the empire. Justinian had a great goal: the renovatio imperii, the restoration of the Roman Empire to its former greatness. Under his general Belisarius, he launched powerful campaigns. First, the Vandal Empire in North Africa was smashed. Then the Ostrogothic Empire in Italy was conquered. Even parts of Spain temporarily fell back under Byzantine control. For a moment, it seemed as if ancient Rome had risen, with Constantinople as its capital. But this dream came at a high price: endless wars, high taxes, exhausted resources. Many of the newly gained territories were soon to be lost again. The Nika uprisings. But Justinian was not only challenged externally. Tensions also arose internally. In 532, a huge uprising broke out in Constantinople, known as the Nika riots. The trigger was initially disputes between rival circus parties, but soon an uprising against the emperor himself developed. The city was in flames, the throne was tottering. At that moment, it was Theodora who made the decision. Escape was not an option. She would rather die dressed in purple. Their determination gave Justinian the strength to crack down. He had the uprisings crushed with brutal force. Tens of thousands lost their lives, but his rule was saved. The construction of the Hagia Sophia. After the uprising, Justinian began to reshape Constantinople. His greatest work was the Hagia Sophia, which was inaugurated in 537. With its massive dome, golden mosaics, and unique architecture, it was a wonder of the world. For his contemporaries, it was more than just a church. It was the visible proof of the emperor's divine mission. Even today, the Hagia Sophia stands as a symbol of the greatness of the Byzantine Empire and of Justinian's claim to renew and glorify the empire. The Corpus Juris Civilis. In addition to wars and buildings, Justinian's most important legacy was his work in the field of law. He had Roman law collected, arranged, and rewritten, the famous Corpus Juris Civilis. This body of legislation lasted for centuries and formed the basis for the European legal system until modern times. Shine and shadow. Justinian's reign was characterized by an almost superhuman claim. He wanted to renew Rome, strengthen the faith, order the world. In many ways, he succeeded, but it was a splendor that was dearly bought. After his death, the empire was exhausted, the finances ruined, and many conquered territories were threatened again. And yet, he is remembered as one of the great emperors. With him, Byzantium reached a height that only a few rulers would ever reach again.
Under Justinian, Rome, Christianity, and the Byzantine vision combined to form an empire that seemed invincible for a moment.
Chapter 5. The construction of the Hagia Sophia and the Byzantine cultural blossom. If there is one building that embodies the spirit of the Byzantine Empire, it is the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. Built under Emperor Justinian I, it survived centuries, fires, earthquakes, and conquests, and still stands today as a symbol of Byzantine splendor. But the Hagia Sophia is not just a building. It is an expression of an entire epoch in which the empire flourished culturally, religiously, and spiritually. A miracle of stone and light. After the Nika uprisings of 532, large parts of Constantinople were destroyed. Justinian saw this not only as a disaster, but also as an opportunity. He wanted to build a building that reflected the greatness of the kingdom and the glory of God. Two master builders, Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, were commissioned. When the church was completed in 537, Justinian is said to have exclaimed at the consecration, "Solomon, I have surpassed you," a reference to the Temple of Jerusalem. The huge dome, which seemed to float weightlessly above the room, was considered a miracle of architecture. Light streamed through the many windows, the mosaics sparkled in gold, and the whole church looked like an image of heaven on earth. For the people of that time, the Hagia Sophia was more than just a church. It was the visible proof of the union between emperor and God, of earthly power and heavenly splendor. Art and icons. But the Hagia Sophia was not the only symbol of Byzantine culture. The whole epoch was characterized by a flowering of art. Icons, images of saints on wooden panels, played a central role in religious life. They were not only regarded as images, but as mediators between believers and saints, as windows to the divine world. The mosaics of the time are still famous today. Composed of millions of small stones, they showed Christ, Mary, emperor, and angel in a splendor that left believers in awe. Golden backgrounds were supposed to symbolize eternity. The figures floated above reality and opened up the view into another world. Education and scholarship. Byzantium was also a kingdom of scholars. In the schools and monasteries, ancient knowledge was preserved, which was increasingly lost in the West. Greek philosophers such as Aristotle or Plato, Roman jurists and doctors, all this knowledge found a new home in Byzantium. The capital, Constantinople, was a center of education, with libraries, academies, and a tradition that preserved its ancient heritage for centuries. Without Byzantium, much of what later fueled the Renaissance in Europe would have been lost. Religion as a cultural power. Byzantine culture was inseparable from religion. The church shaped not only faith, but art, architecture, and politics. The emperor was considered the protector of the Orthodox faith, and the liturgy developed into one of the most magnificent religious rites in the world. The singing of the Byzantine churches, the clouds of incense, the sparkling icons, all this was part of a culture that appealed to the senses and made faith tangible. The Byzantine self-image. The flowering of culture was also an expression of a self-image. Byzantium saw itself as the true Rome, as the guardian of the true church, as the center of the world. At a time when the West was sinking into the chaos of mass migrations, Constantinople shone as a symbol of order, power, and faith. The Hagia Sophia was the heart of this self-image. It connected emperor, church, and people, antiquity and Christianity, earth and heaven. She was the visible face of a culture that reached its peak in the 6th century, and that was to have an impact for centuries to come.
Chapter 6. Byzantium and Persia, rivals in the East. While ancient Rome broke up in the West, the Byzantium Empire remained the eastern pole of an ancient world that had not yet completely disappeared. But Byzantium was not alone. In the East, it faced an equal opponent, the Sassanid Empire of Persia. For centuries, the rivalry between Byzantium and Persia shaped the history of the region. It was a duel between two great powers fighting for influence, trade, and supremacy in the Middle East. Two kingdoms, two cultures. Byzantium and Persia were fundamentally different, and yet they were similar in many ways. Both were successors of great traditions, Byzantium as the heir to Rome, Persia as a continuation of the ancient Iranian empires. Both had a highly developed administration, strong armies, and a clear self-image as the center of the world. While Byzantium was influenced by Christianity, Persia was dominated by Zoroastrianism, the old religion with its dualism between light and darkness. But even there, the ruler played a central role as guarantor of divine order. Endless wars. Even under the early emperors of Constantine's successors, there were repeated wars with Persia. Sometimes the two argued about Armenia, sometimes about Mesopotamia, sometimes about the trade routes to India and China. Neither power could defeat the other once and for all, and so victories and defeats alternated over generations. The conflict became particularly bloody in the 6th and 7th centuries. Under Emperor Justinian I and the Sassanid kings Khosrow I and II, wars raged that devastated entire regions. Campaigns were carried deep into enemy territory, cities were plundered, fortresses besieged. Again and again, the upper hand changed. The Last Great War. The most bitter phase began in the early 7th century. Persia took advantage of the weakness of Byzantium after internal unrest and penetrated deep into the empire. Syria, Palestine, even Egypt fell into Persian hands. For a moment, it seemed as if Byzantium was on the verge of collapse. But then Heraclius came on the scene, one of the most important emperors of the empire. With courageous campaigns, he led the Byzantium troops deep into Persia and decisively defeated the Sassanids. In 628, peace was concluded, and Byzantium regained almost all lost territories. It was a victory, but a victory that was bought dearly. Both empires were bled dry, their resources exhausted, their borders vulnerable. The price of rivalry. The centuries-long conflict between Byzantium and Persia decisively weakened both great powers. They had exhausted each other, just as a new adversary appeared on the scene, the Arab tribes united under the banner of Islam. When the Arab conquests began, Byzantium and Persia were too weakened to put up serious resistance. The Persian Empire fell, and Byzantium lost Syria, Palestine, and Egypt forever. Thus, the rivalry between Byzantium and Persia was on the one hand a struggle between two giants, and on the other hand a prelude to what followed. It had determined the political map for centuries, and yet, in the end, it opened the door to a completely new world power. Chapter 7. The Arab Conquests. The beginning of the threat. No sooner had Byzantium reconquered its old territories after the grueling wars against Persia under Emperor Heraclius than a new opponent emerged who fundamentally changed the world order, the Arab conquests. What initially appeared to be a local uprising on the edge of the desert developed in just a few decades into a movement that conquered Syria, Egypt, North Africa, and large parts of the Middle East, and thus plunged the Byzantine Empire into one of its most serious crises. The rise of Islam. In 622, when Heraclius was waging his campaigns against Persia, the Prophet Muhammad fled from Mecca to Medina, an event known as Hijra that marks the beginning of the Islamic era. A religious movement quickly became a political and military force. Under the first caliphs, the Arab tribes, which had often been at odds before, united. Their energy, religious zeal, and the weakness of their neighbors gave them an advantage that they soon turned into formidable conquests. The first blows against Byzantium. As early as 636, the Arabs met the Byzantine troops at the Battle of Yarmouk in Syria. What followed was a crushing defeat for Byzantium. Within a few years, Syria and Palestine were lost, territories that had been part of the core of the empire for centuries. The loss of Egypt in 642 weighed even more heavily. Egypt was not only rich in grain and money, but also a strategic centerpiece. With its loss, Byzantium lost not only an economic base, but also control over the eastern Mediterranean. An empire in retreat. The Arab expansions continued. Armenia, North Africa, even parts of Asia Minor were threatened. Byzantium had to experience how its former glory areas were lost piece by piece.
From an empire that had dominated the Mediterranean under Justinian, Byzantium now shrank to Greece, Anatolia, and a few scattered possessions. Heraclius himself, who had been celebrated as the victor over the Persians, died bitterly in 641. His last years were overshadowed by defeats, and many contemporaries saw the Arab conquests as a divine punishment. Constantinople in danger. But despite all the setbacks, Byzantium did not give up. The Arabs advanced as far as the Bosporus and besieged Constantinople several times, first in 674 to 678, later in 717 to 718. But the city's massive walls, the discipline of the defenders, and a decisive weapon saved the empire: the mysterious Greek fire, a burning liquid that did not go out on the water and sent the Arab fleets into panic. These defensive battles were decisive. If Constantinople had fallen, Christianity might have been wiped out in the east, but the city held out and thus remained a bulwark against Arab expansion into Europe. A new Byzantine Empire. The Arab conquests marked the end of the ancient Roman world. Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, once central provinces, were lost forever. The empire had to reinvent itself, smaller, more defensive, more concentrated on Anatolia. Byzantium was no longer the Roman Empire in the old sense. It was now an empire that had to learn to live with constant threats, that developed new military systems, and that relied on its Greek culture and the Orthodox faith. The Arabs had led Byzantium to the brink of the abyss, but the empire proved its astonishing resilience. It survived, changed, weakened, but at the same time renewed. The great transformation that finally turned ancient Rome into the Byzantium we know today had begun.
Chapter 8: The Thematic Constitution and Byzantine Military Power. After the devastating losses caused by the Arab conquests, the Byzantine Empire had to change fundamentally. It had become too small to maintain its old structure and too threatened to remain in old patterns. Out of this necessity arose one of the most ingenious systems in the medieval world, the thematic constitution. It combined the military, administration, and society in a new model that allowed Byzantium to survive for centuries. Origin of the topics. The word thema originally referred to a military unit, and later also to the district in which this unit was stationed. From the 7th century onwards, the empire organized its remaining territories in Anatolia into such themes. Each of these districts had a strategos, a military and at the same time civilian governor, who was responsible for defense and administration. In contrast to the old Roman provincial administration, the theme was a militarized region. The farmers in the themes were given land that they were allowed to cultivate, but had to serve as soldiers in return. This created a system that ensured the supply of the army and at the same time defended the borders. Peasants as warriors. This model turned free peasants into defenders of the empire at the same time. They were not only taxpayers, but directly involved in the military organization. Every farmer knew that in the event of war, he had to take up the sword to protect his country and the empire. This created an army that consisted not only of mercenaries, but of men who were bound to the empire with their property and their lives. This gave Byzantium enormous resilience, especially in times of constant attack. Greek fire and fleet. In addition to the army organization, the Byzantine fleet also played a decisive role. With the mysterious Greek fire, a flammable liquid that continued to flicker even on the water, the Byzantines succeeded in repelling attacks by Muslim fleets again and again. The combination of strong walls, a powerful fleet, and a defensive peasant army made Constantinople practically impregnable. The Arab sieges failed, and the empire survived. Stability through the topics. The theme system was not only militarily successful, but also socially stabilizing. It bound the population more closely to the Reich, gave them security, and enabled them to be permanently ready for defense. Of course, the system was not without tensions. The strategists were able to develop great power, and over time, some tended to behave like petty princes. But overall, the thematic constitution was the key to why Byzantium was able to survive the centuries between the 7th and 10th centuries, while other empires fell. From Rome to Greek identity.
With the theme system, Byzantium finally changed. It was no longer ancient Rome that relied on cities and provinces. It was now a Greek-influenced military empire whose center was Anatolia and whose strength came from the defensiveness of its rural population. The peasants in the themes, the strategists in their garrisons, the fleet on the Bosporus, they all kept the empire alive. Without them, Constantinople would probably have fallen as early as the 7th century. In this way, the thematic constitution shows how a new strength could be born out of a crisis. It was the answer to the Arab threat, and it became the backbone of Byzantine power for centuries.
Chapter 9. Iconoclasm. Controversy over the images. Byzantium was not only a kingdom of swords and walls, but also a kingdom of faith. The Orthodox faith shaped every aspect of life, from politics to art. But it was precisely this close connection that led to one of the fiercest conflicts in the history of the empire, iconoclasm, the dispute over the veneration of images. The meaning of icons. Icons were much more than works of art. They were regarded as windows to the divine, as mediators between heaven and earth. In churches, monasteries, and houses, they hung on the walls, were venerated, kissed, and given incense. For the faithful, they were a visible expression of their faith. But not everyone saw this positively. Some theologians and emperors began to doubt, wasn't the veneration of icons really idolatry, a return to pagan practices? The first iconoclasm. In the 8th century, the conflict broke out openly. Emperor Leo III ordered around 726 that icons be removed and their veneration banned. This was the beginning of the first great iconoclasm. Monasteries were devastated, icons destroyed, monks persecuted. For the proponents of this policy, it was a purification of faith, a sacrilege for the opponents. The monks in particular fought passionately against the ban. They saw the icons as an indispensable part of Orthodox spirituality. The dispute divided society, provoked uprisings, and led to bloody clashes. Restoration and second dispute. Under Empress Irene, the Synod of Nicaea took place in 787, which restored the veneration of icons. But the dispute did not end there. In the 9th century, it erupted again, this time under Emperor Leo V. It was not until 843, under the regent Theodora, that icon veneration was finally reintroduced, an event that is still celebrated in the Orthodox Church today as a triumph of orthodoxy. More than a religious conflict. Iconoclasm was not only a theological debate, but also a political and social conflict. The emperors who rejected icons often wanted to break the power of the monasteries, which had become very powerful through land ownership and influence. Behind the dispute over images were also struggles for property, power, and authority. Foreign policy also played a role. Some emperors wanted to appease the Muslims and Jews who rejected the veneration of images with their ban on images. Consequences for culture and identity. The dispute weakened Byzantium, destroyed countless works of art, and deepened rifts within society. But it also led to a clarification. In the end, the role of icons was firmly anchored in the faith, and the Orthodox Church received a strong identity mark that still shapes it today. Iconoclasm shows how deeply religion and politics were intertwined in Byzantium. Pictures were not just pictures, they were symbols of power, faith, and culture, and their quarrel shook the empire more than many wars.
Chapter 10. The Macedonian Age, Rise and Cultural Blossoming. After the turmoil of iconoclasm, Byzantium entered an era in the 9th and 10th centuries that historians later referred to as the Macedonian Age. With the Macedonian dynasty, which ruled from 867 to 1056, the empire experienced a phase of political strength, territorial successes, and cultural upswing. It was a time in which Byzantium not only survived, but shone in new splendor. Basil I, the founder of the dynasty. The first emperor of this line was Basilius I, a man of humble origin from Thrace, whose rise was almost fairy tale-like.
From the groom, he reached the court through his skills and luck, won the trust of the emperor, and finally sat himself on the throne. It marked the beginning of an era marked by prudent administration, military reforms, and a conscious return to traditional Roman values. Basilius knew how to lay the foundations for a long flowering period. Military successes. The Macedonian emperors strengthened the army, consolidated the thematic system, and led successful campaigns. Under Nicephorus Phocas and Johannes Trismegistus, large parts of Syria and Cilicia were reconquered by the Arabs. Crete, which had long been a pirate nest, fell back to Byzantium, and the Bulgarians were also pushed back. These victories gave the empire a new self-confidence. For the first time in centuries, Byzantium was on the rise again, and not only on the defensive. Basil II, the Bulgarian butcher. The climax came under Basil II, who ruled from 976 to 1025. His nickname, Bulgarochtonos, the Bulgarian butcher, comes from his decades-long wars against the Bulgarian Empire. With iron perseverance and military skill, he succeeded in defeating Bulgaria and fully integrating it into the Byzantine Empire. Under Basil II, Byzantium reached its greatest expansion since Justinian. The empire stretched from southern Italy to Armenia, from the Balkans to Syria. His authority was consolidated, his army feared. Culture and education, the Macedonian Renaissance. But the Macedonian era was not only a time of the sword, but also a time of the spirit. Historians speak of a Macedonian Renaissance, a rebirth of ancient education and culture. Monasteries and schools experienced an upswing. Libraries were created. Old texts were copied and commented on. Ancient authors such as Homer or Aristotle were studied again, and at the same time, Christian theology flourished. In art, magnificent mosaics and icons were created, which are still among the masterpieces of Byzantine culture today. The architecture also flourished, with new churches that continued the tradition of the Hagia Sophia. Stability and identity. The Macedonian age was an era in which Byzantium consolidated its identity. It was no longer an empire in crisis, but an empire that showed its strength and towered over it culturally. But the seeds of new problems had already been planted. After Basil II, there was a lack of strong rulers. The successors squandered the resources they had built up, and new threats were soon to appear. But for a moment in the 10th and early 11th centuries, Byzantium was so strong that it could once again be considered the true heiress of Rome.
Chapter 11. Byzantium and the Slavs. Mission, Power, and the Legacy of Cyril and Methodius. Byzantium was not only a military power that asserted itself against Arabs, Persians, or Bulgarians, it was also a cultural and spiritual force that extended its influence far beyond the borders of the empire. This became particularly clear in contact with the Slavs, who advanced into the Balkans from the 6th century onwards and settled in southeastern Europe. The encounter between Byzantine culture and Slavic peoples gave rise to a development whose effect is still felt today. The challenge of the Slavs. When the Slavs streamed south across the Danube in the 6th and 7th centuries, they were initially a threat to Byzantium. Villages were devastated, swaths of land were depopulated, and the empire had to expend enormous forces to defend its Balkan provinces. But over time, it became clear that the Slavs could not simply be driven out. They settled permanently, founded principalities, and soon formed their own political structures. For Byzantium, the question was, should we fight these new neighbors or try to win them over? Mission instead of conquest. The answer was typically Byzantine. Instead of relying on the sword alone, faith was relied on. The missionary work of the Slavs became the great task of the church. The aim was to integrate the new peoples into the spiritual and cultural sphere of Constantinople. In the 9th century, two brothers from Thessalonica emerged who became symbolic figures of this mission, Cyril and Methodius. They mastered the language of the Slavs and developed a script, the Glagolitic alphabet, which later became the Cyrillic alphabet. In doing so, they made it possible to translate the Bible and the liturgy into the Slavic languages. The legacy of Cyril and Methodius. The work of the two brothers was invaluable.
They not only created a script, but also laid the foundation for an independent Slavic culture, which was nevertheless deeply connected to Byzantium. Through the translations, the Slavic peoples became part of the Christian world, the Orthodox world, which was shaped by Constantinople. This was particularly evident in Bulgaria, where Tsar Boris I embraced Christianity in the 9th century and brought the Byzantine Church to the country. Later followed Kievan Rus, which was baptized in 988 under Grand Duke Vladimir. This step marked the beginning of the close connection between Byzantium and the Russian world, which deeply imprinted Constantinople's cultural heritage on Slavic history. Power by faith. For Byzantium, this development was a strategic triumph. Without major wars of conquest, it gained influence over huge areas. Slavic princes sought proximity to the emperor in Constantinople, took over titles, married into Byzantine families, and thus became part of the political system. Christianity was the strongest weapon of the empire. With him, he succeeded in doing what armies could not achieve: a lasting bond. A legacy to the present day. The mission among the Slavs had consequences that reached far beyond the Middle Ages. Orthodoxy, the Cyrillic script, the liturgical traditions, all of this still shapes countries such as Russia, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Ukraine. They all carry a piece of Byzantium forward in their culture. For Byzantium itself, the mission was proof of its cultural superiority. It was not only a military bulwark, but also a spiritual center that shaped new peoples. In doing so, it secured influence far beyond its borders and created a legacy that is still alive today. Chapter 12: The Crusades and Byzantium, Between Alliance and Betrayal. When the call for the First Crusade echoed through Europe in the late 11th century, Byzantium had long since ceased to be the undisputed great power of the East. Although the empire had grown stronger under the Macedonians, the growing threat from the Seljuks, a Turkish equestrian people, had shaken Anatolia. The Battle of Manzikert in 1071, in which the Byzantium suffered a crushing defeat, opened the gates of Asia Minor to the Turks. Large swaths of land were lost, and the empire was on the verge of collapse. In this situation, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos turned to the west. He asked the Pope and the princes of Europe for military help to push back the Turks. What he received, however, exceeded all expectations and presented Byzantium with new problems. The First Crusade: Hope and Danger. When the First Crusade began in 1096, not only a few knights, but entire armies of crusaders moved eastwards. Alexios had hoped for a few thousand mercenaries, but got tens of thousands of impetuous pilgrims who were more of a danger than a help. Despite tensions, the Crusaders managed to recapture important areas for Byzantium on their march to Jerusalem, such as Nicaea and parts of western Anatolia. But at the same time, they deeply mistrusted each other. The Crusaders saw the Byzantiums as cunning, weak Greeks. The Byzantiums saw the Crusaders as impetuous barbarians who could hardly be controlled. Alliance and betrayal. This field of tension continued in the following crusades. Sometimes Byzantium and the Crusaders worked together, sometimes they stabbed each other in the back. Byzantium emperors tried to involve the Crusaders in their own politics, but the knights from the west had their own goals: glory, booty, and the conquest of Jerusalem. Again and again there were accusations. The Crusaders accused the Byzantiums of treason because they were too cautious or even too anxious to compromise with the Muslims. The Byzantiums, on the other hand, saw the Crusaders as unreliable guests who did more harm than good. The catastrophe of the Fourth Crusade. The fragile relationship reached its lowest point in 1204. The Fourth Crusade, originally directed towards Egypt, was directed to Constantinople by circumstances and Venetian interests. Under the pretext of helping a Byzantium prince to power, the Crusaders conquered the capital and plundered it in one of the most gruesome episodes of the Middle Ages. Churches were desecrated, sanctuaries stolen, works of art destroyed. For the Byzantiums, this was an indelible trauma. Not Muslims, but Christians from the West had devastated the heart of their empire. The mistrust between East and West, between the Orthodox and Catholic churches, thus became unbridgeable. Between two worlds. The Crusades presented Byzantium with a dilemma. On the one hand, they were an opportunity to win support against the Turks. On the other hand, they were a threat to their own sovereignty. In the end, they proved to be a double-edged sword that did more harm than good. For Byzantium, the Crusades did not mean liberation, but weakening. While the West conquered Jerusalem and lost it again, Byzantium lost its position as the undisputed power in the East. The memory of 1204 was to poison the relationship between Eastern and Western Europe for centuries. So the Crusades were not the hoped-for lifeline for Byzantium, but a chapter full of mistrust, misunderstandings, and in the end, betrayal.
Chapter 13. The Schism of 1054, East and West in Breach. The Byzantine Empire always saw itself as the true Rome, as the guardian of the right faith and the center of the Christian world. But while Constantinople asserted its authority in the East, its own order had developed in the West, Latin Christianity under the leadership of the Pope in Rome. For centuries there were tensions between the two churches, but in 1054 there was a final break, the Great Schism, which divided Christianity into East and West. Different paths. The causes lay deep. While the West developed its own structures after the collapse of the Roman Empire, the East remained more closely attached to the Roman Greek tradition. In the West, Latin was the language of the Church. In the East, Greek. The Pope claimed a position of supremacy, while in Constantinople, the Patriarch and the Emperor jointly led the Church. There were also differences in questions of doctrine and liturgy, for example, in the use of unleavened bread in the Eucharist, in the celibacy of priests, or in the famous filioque question, i.e., the question of whether the Holy Spirit proceeds only from the Father or also from the Son. The path to break. These differences repeatedly led to tensions, but compromises were sought. It was not until the 11th century that the situation worsened. Pope Leo IX and Patriarch Michael Carularios got into a fierce argument. Envoys of the Pope traveled to Constantinople to negotiate, but the encounter escalated. In 1054, the papal legates placed a bull of excommunication on the altar during a service in the Hagia Sophia. Carularios reacted with a counter-statement. This was the break. Rome and Constantinople declared each other heretics. More than just a theological dispute. The schism was not only a question of faith, but also of politics. The Pope in Rome wanted to extend his primacy over the whole of Christendom, while Byzantium wanted to defend its own tradition and autonomy. Behind the religious arguments, therefore, there were also questions of power. Consequences for Byzantium. For the Byzantium Empire, the schism was a heavy blow. The dream of a unified Christianity was gone, and alienation from the West grew. When the Crusaders came later, mistrust was already deeply rooted. The events of 1204 only increased this gap. The Schism of 1054 marked the beginning of a permanent separation that still exists today: Orthodoxy in the East, Catholicism in the West. For Byzantium, it meant that it was left without the support of the West at a crucial stage in history. Indeed, that the West even developed as a rival. A rift through Christianity. The schism is an example of how deep cultural, linguistic, and political differences can be. It was not only a theological dispute, but a final expression of the fact that East and West had developed apart. From then on, Byzantium saw itself as the guardian of orthodoxy, while Rome saw itself as the center of the Catholic world. Two worlds faced each other, and the old unity of the Roman Empire was forever broken.
Chapter 14. The Catastrophe of 1204, the Fourth Crusade and the Conquest of Constantinople. There are many dark hours in the history of the Byzantine Empire, but none as traumatic as the year 1204. That year, Constantinople experienced what no one could have imagined. The proud capital of the Christian East was plundered not by Muslims, but by Western Christians, by the Crusaders of the Fourth Crusade. This event weakened the empire so much that it would never fully recover from it. A crusade without direction. The Fourth Crusade was originally directed against Egypt, but it soon became apparent that the Crusaders did not have enough money to pay for their passage. They turned to the Republic of Venice, which provided ships, but at a high price. Since the Crusaders could not pay their debts,
The Venetians first directed the train to Zara, a Christian city that they had to conquer to serve Venice's interests. In this situation, a Byzantine prince appeared on the scene, Alexios Angelos, son of a deposed emperor. He promised the Crusaders money and support if they helped him regain the throne in Constantinople. For the Crusaders, this was an opportunity to pay off their debts. The March on Constantinople. In 1203, the Crusaders marched outside the walls of Constantinople. They forcibly placed Alexios on the throne. But it soon became apparent that he could not keep his promises. Tensions grew, and in April 1204, the situation escalated. The Crusaders decided to conquer the city for themselves. The looting. On April 13, 1204, they stormed Constantinople. What followed was a disaster. Churches were desecrated, altars destroyed, holy relics stolen. The Hagia Sophia, the heart of Orthodox Christianity, was plundered, horses housed in it, its sanctuary desecrated. Monasteries were burned down, and priceless works of art were deported to the West. Even chroniclers of the West, who otherwise glorified the Crusades, were horrified by the cruelty. For the Byzantines, it was an indelible trauma that was deeply imprinted in the collective memory. The Latin Empire. After the conquest, the Crusaders established a Latin Empire, which lasted from 1204 to 1261. But it was weak and volatile, constantly threatened by the remnants of Byzantine resistance. The once mighty empire had been shattered, its resources plundered, its capital desecrated. Consequences for Byzantium. The conquest of 1204 was more than just a military blow. It finally destroyed the trust between East and West. The Schism of 1054 had divided Christendom, but the sack of Constantinople destroyed any hope of reconciliation. For Byzantium, it meant the beginning of decline. Although the city was recaptured in 1261, the empire was never as strong as before. His economic base was ruined, his reputation damaged, and his power weakened. An indelible trauma. The catastrophe of 1204 shows how much political and economic interests had perverted the original idea of the Crusade. For the Byzantium, however, it was more than that. It was a betrayal that robbed the empire of its soul. Byzantium never fully recovered from this blow, and it was to poison the relationship between the Orthodox and Catholic worlds into modern times.
Chapter 15. The Latin Empire and the Byzantine Revival in Nicaea. After the catastrophe of 1204, the Byzantine Empire was shattered. Constantinople, the magnificent capital, was in the hands of the Crusaders and Venetians, the heart of the empire desecrated. On the ruins of the once mighty empire, the Latin Empire of Constantinople was created, an artificial entity that could never replace the splendor and authority of the old emperors. The Latin Empire. The Crusaders shared the spoils. A Latin emperor was installed in Constantinople. The Venetians received large parts of the trade and the coastal cities. Knights from France and Flanders were rewarded with fiefs. But behind the facade, this empire was weak. There was a lack of legitimacy, administrative experience, and ties to the peoples of the East. The Orthodox population despised the new masters. The Latin Church tried to impose its authority, and the Byzantine elites fled to other regions. From the beginning, the Latin Empire was surrounded by enemies. Bulgarians, Greeks, Seljuk Turks, all of them saw the Crusaders as invaders. The refuge in Nicaea. While Constantinople was lost, the Byzantines did not give up. Members of the Laskarid imperial family fled to Nicaea in Asia Minor and built a new center there. The Kingdom of Nicaea became the actual continuation of the Byzantine Empire. From here, the Laskarids organized the resistance, rebuilt the administration and army, and kept the Orthodox faith alive. Nicaea became the new capital of Byzantine exile, a symbol of hope that Constantinople would one day be regained. Other successor states. In addition to Nicaea, other Byzantine successor states emerged, the Despotate of Epirus in the west and the Empire of Trebizond on the Black Sea. They all claimed to be legitimate successors of the old empire.
But in truth, Nicaea was the only power strong enough to continue Constantine's legacy. The way back. For decades, the emperors of Nicaea fought the Latins in Constantinople and consolidated their position in Asia Minor and the Balkans. Under Theodore Lascaris and his successors, it was possible to create a solid foundation. Emperor John III Vatatzes, 1222–1254, in particular proved to be a capable ruler. He waged successful wars, stabilized the economy, and won the trust of the Orthodox Church. Under him, Nicaea flourished almost as much as Constantinople once did. The weakness of the Latins. Meanwhile, the Latin Empire was visibly decaying. Without strong rulers, dependent on Venetian support, and internally divided, it could hardly hold its own. Economically, it was weak, militarily overwhelmed, politically isolated. The Orthodox population remained hostile, and the Byzantine elite in Nicaea was just waiting for the opportune moment. Hope for return. Over the decades, the idea that Constantinople had to be reconquered. The Empire of Nicaea did not see itself as a rule in exile, but as the actual continuation of the Byzantine legacy. The emperor in Nicaea considered himself the true Basileus, while the Latin emperor in Constantinople seemed like a foreign ruler. This dream was to become reality in 1261, when the city was regained in a surprise action. But even now, in the 13th century, it was clear that the Byzantine people had not given up hope. The Latin Empire was only an interlude, a foreign body in a world that regarded Constantinople as the heart of the East. And Nicaea was the source from which the Old Kingdom was to be reborn.
Chapter 16. The Reconquest of Constantinople in 1261, Hope and Reality. After almost 60 years of foreign rule by the Latins, Constantinople seemed to have become an unattainable dream for many Byzantines. The city was no longer the shining center of the world, but a weakened empire in the hands of a Western nobility that could hardly maintain its rule. But in 1261 came the moment that the successors of the old Byzantine emperors in Nicaea had been waiting for, the reconquest of Constantinople. Michael VIII Palaiologos, the new emperor. In the Kingdom of Nicaea, a stable rule had developed under the Lascarids, but in 1259, a new man seized power, Michael VIII Palaiologos. With skill and determination, he asserted himself as co-emperor and set out to realize the great goal of returning to Constantinople. Michael was an experienced politician and strategist. He knew how to forge alliances, play enemies off against each other, and at the same time strengthen Byzantine self-confidence. Under him, the dream of returning took on a concrete form. The weakness of the Latins. The Latin Empire was a shadow of its former self at that time. It was economically dependent on Venice, militarily weakened, and politically isolated. The native population had never developed any real loyalty to the Latin emperors. Constantinople itself was run down, its splendor faded, its power limited. The decisive moment. In 1261, Michael VIII concluded a treaty with Genoa, Venice's rival. Genoa promised military aid and naval support in return for trade privileges. Even before this alliance took effect, however, a surprising opportunity arose. A small Byzantine force under General Alexios Strategopoulos discovered that the Latin troops had left Constantinople to fight against enemies outside the city. With only a few thousand soldiers, Strategopoulos dared to attack. In a cloak and dagger operation, the Byzantines managed to penetrate the city and open the gates. When the inhabitants learned that the old masters had returned, the city rose up against the Latins. The Latin emperor hastily fled westwards, while Constantinople fell back into Byzantine hands without much battle. A triumph with a dark side. In August 1261, Michael VIII entered Constantinople. The return was celebrated as a divine miracle, as the rebirth of the Byzantine Empire. For the first time since 1204, the banners of the emperors flew over the walls of the city. But the reality was sobering. Constantinople had been plundered, its palaces destroyed, its population shrunk. The former glory was gone, and the resources needed to rebuild the empire were limited. In addition, Michael VIII had antagonized the Venetian camp through his alliance with Genoa.
The result was an endless rivalry between Genoa and Venice, which drew Byzantium deeper and deeper into the conflicts between the Italian maritime powers. Hope and reality. The reconquest of Constantinople was a triumph of the will and a symbolic event of enormous importance. It showed that the Byzantine Empire, despite all the defeats and traumas, was not yet dead. But at the same time, it became clear that it would never reach its old strength again. The realm of the Palaiologos was a realm of hope that lived on the memory of former greatness. But in reality, it was weakened, surrounded by enemies, and dependent on Western powers. 1261 brought the return, but not a real rebirth. Instead, the last long phase of the empire began, a struggle for survival in a world that had changed irrevocably.
Chapter 17. Byzantium in the Shadows, Ottomans, Serbs, and Bulgarians. After the reconquest of Constantinople in 1261, one could have hoped that the Byzantium Empire would regain its old strength. But the reality was different. Under the dynasty of the Palaiologists, a long phase of struggle for survival began. Although Constantinople held out for almost 2 centuries, it was no longer the dominant power of the Mediterranean, but an empire in the shadow of its neighbors, besieged by the Ottomans, Serbs, and Bulgarians. Inner weaknesses. The empire was already weakened internally. The population had drastically shrunk, the economy was on the ground, and many territories were lost. Constantinople had been regained, but not the provinces that had once constituted its strength. Without the rich granaries of Egypt or Syria, without the flourishing cities of Asia Minor, there was a lack of resources to rebuild the empire. In addition, there were endless struggles for the throne and civil wars, which paralyzed the strength of the empire. While Emperor Michael VIII and his successors tried to stabilize the empire, internal power struggles repeatedly undermined unity. The Bulgarian threat. In the 13th and early 14th centuries, the Second Bulgarian Empire was a serious rival. Under rulers such as Ivan Asen II, Bulgaria controlled large parts of the Balkans. Byzantium had to experience how it was pushed back on its own soil, while Bulgarian princes staged themselves as successors to the old empire. Although it later succeeded in weakening Bulgaria, the competition for supremacy in the Balkans remained. The Serbian Empire. The rise of Serbia became even more dangerous in the 14th century. Under Stefan Dušan, r. 1331 through 1355, the Serbian Empire reached its greatest extent, from the Adriatic Sea to Greece. Dušan assumed the title Emperor of the Serbs and Romans and thus claimed to be the successor to the Byzantium Empire himself. Byzantium watched its former territories be ruled by new powers and could do little about it. The rise of the Ottomans. The most consequential threat, however, was the threat from Anatolia. While Byzantium had lost many territories there after the Battle of Manzikert and the subsequent Turkish conquests, small Turkish principalities, so-called beyliks, were formed. One of them, that of the Ottomans, was soon to become the greatest danger to the empire. In the late 13th and early 14th centuries, the Ottomans began to systematically advance into Asia Minor. In 1326, they conquered Bursa and made it their capital. Attacks on Europe soon followed. They reached Thrace via the Hellespont and founded a new power base with Edirne. For Byzantium, this was the beginning of the end. The Ottomans were not only militarily strong, but also skilled in politics. They used Byzantium's civil wars, supported rival pretenders to the throne, and thus secured more and more influence. A realm in the shadows. In the 14th century, the Byzantium Empire was limited to Constantinople and a few territories. While the Ottomans grew stronger and stronger, while Serbia and Bulgaria struggled for supremacy in the Balkans, Byzantium remained weak and divided. The empire, which had once ruled the entire Mediterranean region, was now a plaything of greater powers. His reputation was damaged, his army small, his fleet insignificant. And yet, Constantinople survived. Through its mighty walls, through diplomatic skill, through the skillful playing off of powers against each other. But it was clear, the empire was only living for a limited time. Chapter 18. The last splendor: art, scholarship, and diplomacy in late Byzantium. The Byzantine Empire of the 14th and 15th centuries was only a shadow of its former self, politically and militarily. It had lost large parts of its territory, was confined to Constantinople and a few territories, and lived in constant dependence on its powerful neighbors. And yet, it was precisely in this period of weakness that Byzantium once again unfolded a splendor in art, scholarship, and diplomacy that was to secure its legacy for world history. A city full of memories. Constantinople, even though it was economically impoverished, remained a cultural and spiritual center. Its churches, monasteries, and palaces were full of works of art and writings that came from centuries of Byzantine history. Even though the city was only a shadow of the old metropolis, it retained an aura of sacredness and tradition. The Byzantine emperors knew how to stage this tradition. They held sumptuous ceremonies, cultivated their role as basileus of the Romans, and presented themselves as the keepers of a glorious past. Art and icons in late Byzantium. In art, there was a final upswing. The Paleological Renaissance, named after the Paleologist dynasty, brought about a new flowering of painting. Icons became finer, more realistic, more expressive. Mosaics, such as the famous ones in the Chora Church in Constantinople, show a deep spirituality and a masterful technique that is still admired today. These works radiated far beyond the borders of the empire. They shaped the Orthodox world and also influenced art in Russia, Serbia, and Bulgaria. Scholarship and knowledge transfer. Scholarship also took on a new meaning. Byzantine scholars continued to study the ancient texts, commenting on them, and thus keeping the knowledge of the Greeks and Romans alive. Especially in the last centuries, when the empire was increasingly threatened, many Byzantine scholars sought contacts in the West. They traveled to Italy, brought manuscripts with them, and taught students. In doing so, they made a decisive contribution to the Renaissance in Europe. Without the preservation and transmission of ancient texts by Byzantium, many foundations of European culture would have been lost. Diplomacy as an art of survival. Politically, Byzantium could only survive through diplomacy. The emperors of the last centuries were masters in maneuvering between Ottomans, Serbs, Bulgarians, Venetians, and Genoese. They sought alliances, made concessions, married princesses, and tried to play the powers off against each other. Sometimes it was possible to gain time, for example, by temporarily recognizing the supremacy of the Ottomans or by bringing the church closer to Rome. But all these measures were ultimately only desperate attempts to delay the inevitable. A last glow in the darkness. As paradoxical as it sounds, at a time when the empire was politically at an end, it once again unfolded culturally and intellectually a radiance that reached far beyond its downfall. The icons, mosaics, writings, and scholars of the late Byzantium ensured that the heritage of the Old World was not lost. This last glow was like a flashing of a dying sun. He made it clear that Byzantium was not only a political empire, but also a culture and spiritual heritage that would last for centuries, even if the walls of Constantinople were to fall one day.
Chapter 19. The Fall of Constantinople, 1453. Mehmed II and the End of an Era. On the morning of May 29, 1453, the bells of Constantinople fell silent. The city, which had defied all enemies for almost 1,000 years, was experiencing its last hour. The fall of Constantinople not only marked the end of the history of the Byzantine Empire, but also an entire era. It was the moment when the Second Rome fell, and the Ottoman Empire took its place. The Ottoman threat. Since the 14th century, the Ottomans had crushed the Byzantine Empire piece by piece. Constantinople had long since become nothing more than an island in a sea of Ottoman rule. Emperor John VIII and his successor Constantine XI had tried in vain to get help from the West. Although there were church unions with Rome, in Byzantium itself these were seen as a betrayal, and the hoped-for Western armies of knights failed to materialize. The young Sultan Mehmed II, barely 20 years old, had a clear goal: the conquest of Constantinople. For him, the city was not only a military target, but a symbol. Whoever conquered Constantinople became the heir of the Roman emperors and the ruler of the world. The siege.
The siege began on 6 April 1453. Mehmed had gathered a huge army of perhaps 80,000 to 100,000 men, supported by a huge fleet. His new weapon was particularly feared: huge cannons cast by a Hungarian master, which threatened even the mighty walls of Constantinople. The Byzantines, on the other hand, had only about 7,000 defenders, including a small group of Genoese mercenaries under Giovanni Giustiniani. Emperor Constantine XI, Palaiologos, personally led the defense, determined to die within the walls of his capital if necessary. The walls and the last revolt. For weeks, the Byzantine walls held out. Again and again the Ottomans stormed, again and again they were repulsed. The huge cannons tore breaches, but the defenders stuffed them with everything they could find. In the city, people prayed, held processions, and hoped for a miracle. But the miracle failed to materialize. The storming of the city. On the morning of May 29, the decisive attack began. Wave after wave, the Ottomans stormed against the walls. First, the poorly armed Bazi-Buzuks, then regular troops, and finally the dreaded Janissaries. When the defenders were tired, a breach fell at the gate of St. Romanus. Giustiniani was badly wounded, his men withdrew, and the defenses collapsed. Emperor Constantine XI took off his purple robe, threw himself into the fray, and disappeared. His body was never clearly identified, and so he became a legend, the last Roman emperor to fall with a sword in his hand. The end of a world. When the Ottoman troops entered the city, a chaos of looting, horror, and despair began. Churches were stormed, people abducted, houses looted. The Hagia Sophia, which had been the heart of orthodoxy for almost 1,000 years, was transformed into a mosque. Mehmed II rode into the city on the same day. He declared Constantinople the new capital of his empire and took the title Kaisar-i Rum, Emperor of Rome. Symbol and turning point. The fall of Constantinople was more than just a military event. For Christianity, it was a shock, a symbol of doom. For Europe, it marked the end of the Middle Ages. Many historians place 1453 as the beginning of the modern era. For the Ottomans, it was the beginning of a new era. Constantinople, now Istanbul, became the center of an empire that shaped world politics for centuries. For Byzantium, however, it was the end. After more than 1,000 years, the empire, which had always seen itself as Rome's heir, became extinct. But its intellectual and cultural heritage lived on, in the Orthodox world, in art, in literature, and, last but not least, in the Renaissance, which was fueled by Byzantine scholars in Italy.
Chapter 20. Reverberations and Legacy. Byzantium in Europe and World History. With the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the Byzantine Empire was history, but its legacy lived on. Moreover, in many respects, the actual history of Byzantium's impact only began after its downfall. For this empire, which for so long saw itself as the real Rome, had left traces that reach into the present day. Keeper of Antiquity. One of Byzantium's greatest achievements was the preservation of ancient knowledge. While many works of Greek philosophers, historians, and scientists were lost in the West, they were copied, commented on, and studied in Constantinople. When Byzantium scholars fled to Italy after the fall of Constantinople, they brought these treasures with them. In doing so, they laid the foundation for the Renaissance, a movement that spiritually renewed Europe and ushered in the modern era. Without Byzantium, much of what we now regard as the foundation of European culture, from Homer to Aristotle, might have been lost forever. Orthodoxy and the Slavic world. Equally formative was the influence on the Orthodox Church. Byzantium had not only shaped the dogmas and liturgies, but also carried the mission to the Slavs. Russia, Bulgaria, Serbia, all these countries owe their Christian imprint to the Byzantine heritage. After 1453, Moscow in particular saw itself as the heir to Constantinople. The Russian czars called themselves czars, a derivation of Caesar, and stylized their city as the Third Rome. Thus, the idea of empire lived on, even after Constantinople had fallen. Art and architecture. In art, Byzantium has shaped orthodoxy to this day.
The icons, the mosaics, the architecture of the churches, all this is an expression of a spirituality that emerged from Byzantium. Even in remote monasteries of the Balkans or in the cathedrals of Russia, the signature of this unique culture can be found. The Hagia Sophia remains the greatest symbol, a building that inspired generations of architects and that continues to amaze people today. Diplomacy and statesmanship. Byzantium also left a legacy in politics. His skillful diplomacy, his system of alliances, his ability to play enemies off against each other, all of this was admired and partly adopted in Europe. The Byzantium later became proverbial for complicated, sophisticated politics. An ambivalent legacy. But Byzantium was not only admired. In Western Europe, it was often viewed with suspicion, seen as decadent, intriguing, weak. This image was reinforced in the 18th and 19th centuries by historians such as Edward Gibbon, who portrayed Byzantium as an empire in decline. It is only in recent times that the tremendous achievement that this empire has accomplished in its thousand-year existence has been recognized again. The legacy. In the end, the Byzantium Empire remains a link between antiquity and modern times, between Orient and Occident, between Rome and the world of the Slavs. It survived centuries of crises, preserved the faith, kept knowledge alive, and shaped a culture that continues to have an impact today. With the fall in 1453, a political power ended, but not the intellectual legacy. Byzantium lives on in the church domes of Russia, in the libraries of the Renaissance, in the icons of Orthodox Christians. It is part of our history, an empire that stood in the shadows and yet passed on a light that illuminates the world today.